When my son raised his champagne glass in front of 50 guests and said that I was an idiot trying to buy love the way you buy bread at a bakery, I felt my heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. Laughter echoed through the banquet hall as I held the keys to the luxury SUV I had just given him. 500,000 reis. 40 years of sewing, saving, and sacrifice summed up in a single public insult. But let me go back a bit. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I've spent 65 years in this world, and for the last 40, I've lived exclusively for one person, my son. He was born when I was 25, and 3 months later, my husband died in a car accident on his way home from work. I was left alone with a baby, no family nearby, no college degree, and nothing but an old sewing machine my mother had left me before she passed away. I learned to sew when I was 10 years old. I never imagined that skill would become my only source of income. I started by mending clothes for neighbors, then moved on to sewing custom garments. I worked 16 hours a day. My fingers bled, my back ached, but I didn't stop. Every stitch I made was one step closer to giving my son the life he deserved. When he was 7, I managed to rent a small space and open my own workshop. Nothing fancy. Just 3 sewing machines and 2 employees who helped me with larger orders. The business grew slowly, but it grew. Little by little, I expanded. 10 years later, I had 15 employees and supplied clothes to stores in 3 different cities. My son always had everything. He studied at the best private schools I could afford. I made sure he learned English, practiced sports, took music lessons. While other mothers could rest on Sundays, I worked. While my friends went out to dinner, I saved every penny. I never bought new clothes for myself. Never took a vacation. My entire life revolved around making sure he had opportunities. And he took advantage of them. He graduated in law at 23. Got a job at a prestigious law firm. 2 years later, he met her. The woman who would become my daughter-in-law. From a wealthy family, daughter of entrepreneurs, used to a lifestyle I had never known. From our first meeting, I noticed the way she looked at me. That look of silent judgment and disapproval. The wedding was 5 years ago. An expensive ceremony that I helped pay for, even though my daughter-in-law and her parents could have easily covered everything themselves. I wanted to contribute. After all, it was my only son's wedding. I spent almost an entire year's profit from my workshop on that party. It was worth it to see my son happy, or at least that's what I thought at the time. After the wedding, things changed. At first, it was small things. He took longer to return my calls. When I suggested lunch, there was always an excuse. Work, social commitments, travel. The visits became rare. When they did happen, they were brief and formal. He'd arrive, stay half an hour, constantly check his watch. My daughter-in-law never hid her disdain. Once, when I visited their apartment, she made a point of cleaning the couch right after I stood up to leave. I overheard her telling a friend on the phone how embarrassing it was to have a seamstress as a mother-in-law. As if my profession were something to be ashamed of. I tried to talk to my son about it. He laughed, said I was exaggerating, that she didn't mean anything by it. But I knew. A mother always knows when something is wrong. The problem wasn't just her. It was him too. My son was becoming someone I didn't recognize. He started asking for money often. Investments, he said. Unique opportunities. Loans he promised to repay but never did. I gave him everything. Sold equipment from the workshop, reduced my profits, withdrew money from my savings. I wanted to help. I wanted him to succeed. But the more I gave, the less he valued it. The calls only came when he needed something. Usually money. Or some favor. He never asked how I was. Never showed interest in the workshop that had funded his education. It was as if I existed only to serve him. Still I kept trying. Because that's what mothers do, isn't it? They keep loving, keep believing things will get better, that their child will wake up one day and remember everything you did. I clung to that hope like a castaway clings to a piece of wood in the ocean. 2 months ago, My daughter-in-law called me. A rare thing. She said she was organizing a surprise party for my son's 40th birthday. Asked me not to tell him. I was touched by the invitation. Finally, I thought she was including me. Maybe things could get better between us. I decided to do something special. Something that would show my son how much I loved him, how I'd always been there for him. I sold my house. That small house where I raised him alone, where every room held a memory. I sold everything. The furniture, the jewelry my husband had given me before he died, even my mother's sewing machine. With the money, I bought the car. A luxury SUV, imported, brand new. The kind of car my son always said he wanted. 500,000 reais. It was almost everything I had. I kept just enough to rent a simple apartment and keep the workshop running. I spent weeks planning the delivery. I imagined the surprise on his face, the tight hug, maybe even a few tears of emotion. I imagined that gift would reconnect us, bring back the little boy who used to hug me before bed and tell me I was the best mother in the world. The party was in an elegant hall downtown. Expensive decoration, imported flowers, waiters serving French champagne. There were at least 50 people, all well dressed, laughing loudly, showing off expensive jewelry and designer watches. I wore my best dress, one I had sewn myself especially for the occasion. Even so, I felt out of place. My son arrived and pretended surprise perfectly. Everyone shouted congratulations. He hugged his wife, greeted friends, posed for photos. It took almost half an hour before he noticed me in the corner of the hall. When our eyes met, I saw something strange in his face. It wasn't happiness. It was something closer to discomfort. He came over, gave me a quick, formal hug, asked what I was doing there. The question caught me off guard. Your wife invited me, I explained. He just nodded and walked away to talk to other guests. I waited for the right moment. When the waiters started serving dinner, I excused myself and left the hall. I went to the parking lot, grabbed the keys to the SUV parked right at the entrance, with a giant red bow on the hood. My heart was pounding. I was nervous but excited. I went back into the hall and asked for everyone's attention. The room slowly fell silent. I felt all eyes on me. Some people whispered, probably asking who I was. My daughter-in-law had a tense expression on her face, as if annoyed by the interruption. I spoke about how much I loved my son. How I had worked all these years to give him a good life. How proud I was of the man he had become. My hands trembled as I held the keys. I said I had a special gift waiting outside. We all walked to the parking lot. When my son saw the car, his face didn't light up as I had imagined. He looked at his wife, then at me, then back at the car. There was something calculating in his gaze, something cold that sent a chill down my spine. I handed him the keys. Explained that it was his dream car, that I had sold everything I owned to buy it. That it was my way of showing how much he meant to me. Some people clapped politely. Others just watched in silence. Then it happened. My son took the keys, looked at them for a long moment, then raised the champagne glass he was holding in his other hand. I thought he was about to make a toast of gratitude. I thought we'd finally have our moment of reconnection. Instead, he smiled. A cruel smile I had never seen on his face before. And he said those words that destroyed 40 years of love in a single second. He said I was an idiot. That I was trying to buy love like someone buys bread at a bakery. That I would never understand that money couldn't make up for shame. The laughter came. Loud. Merciless. I saw people exchanging glances, some laughing openly, others hiding their smiles behind their glasses. My daughter-in-law was radiant, as if that was exactly what she had hoped would happen. She walked up to my son and kissed his cheek, whispering something in his ear that made him laugh even harder. I stood there, holding my old purse, feeling 50 pairs of eyes judging me. Feeling my world collapse. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. My throat was tight, my eyes burned with tears I refused to shed in front of those people. I turned my back and left. Walked through the parking lot without looking back. I heard more laughter behind me. Heard someone comment about people who don't know their place. I kept walking. Called a taxi and left that party, that humiliation, that moment that would change my life forever. On the way home, or rather to the rented apartment that was now my home, I cried. I cried for 40 years of sacrifice thrown away. I cried for the mother I had been and the son I had raised. I cried for the illusion I had clung to for so long, believing that a mother's love was enough to change someone. But beneath those tears, something else began to grow. A cold anger. A determination I hadn't felt in decades. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't thinking about how to help my son. I was thinking about how to help myself. And in that moment, without knowing exactly how, I decided that that humiliation would not go unanswered. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. I spent 3 days locked in that rented apartment. 3 days without eating properly, without sleeping, just reliving that moment over and over in my head. Each laugh echoed in my mind like a slap in the face. Every word my son said burned deeper than any physical wound could burn. On the 4th day, my phone rang. It was him. For the first time in months, my son was calling me of his own accord. My heart jumped. Maybe he had realized his mistake. Maybe he regretted it. Maybe he was calling to apologize. I answered with a trembling voice. He didn't even say hello. He went straight to the point. The car had a problem with the electrical system and he wanted to know if I had kept the receipt so he could claim the warranty. No apologies. No recognition of what he had done. Just a complaint about the gift that had cost me everything I had. I hung up on him. My hand shook so badly I almost dropped the phone. He called back 3 times. I didn't pick up. Then the messages came. He said I was being dramatic. That it was just a joke. That everyone laughed because it was funny, not because they were laughing at me. Each message made me angrier. I blocked his number. For the first time in 40 years, I blocked my own son. The feeling was strange. Liberating and painful at the same time. It was like ripping a piece of myself out, yet a piece that was rotten and infecting everything around it. A week after the party, an old friend came to visit. I met her when I opened the workshop years ago. She worked in a nearby office and always ordered clothes from me. Over time, we became close. She was one of the few people who knew my whole story. When I opened the door and she saw my state, I didn't need to tell her anything. She came in, made tea, sat beside me and let me talk. I told her everything. The party, the car, the humiliation, the messages. I cried so much I thought there were no more tears left in me. She listened in silence. When I finished, she held my hand and said something that changed everything. She said that for years she had watched me sacrifice every piece of my happiness for a son who didn't deserve it. She said it was time to live for myself. That I had a right to that. That night, after she left, I started doing the math. I had sold my house for 400,000 reis. The car cost 500,000. Where did the extra 100,000 come from? I took it from the workshop's emergency fund. Money that should have been used to pay salaries, taxes, suppliers. But it wasn't just that. In the last 5 years, since the wedding, I calculated that I had lent my son almost 200,000 reis. Investments that never returned. Opportunities that never materialized. Loans that were never repaid. 700,000 reis. Almost 1 million if I counted everything I had spent on him throughout my life. And what did I have to show for it? A 1-bedroom rented apartment. A workshop that was losing money because I had bled it dry. A collection of humiliations and broken promises. That was when something inside me finally broke for good. Or rather, something was repaired. The part of me that always said yes, that always yielded, that always put him first, simply stopped functioning. I began to investigate. I called a distant cousin who worked at the same law firm where my son had worked. I asked how he was doing at work. The answer surprised me. He had been fired 6 months earlier. 6 months. And he never told me. I sought to learn more. Through acquaintances, I discovered he had been dismissed for negligence. He arrived late, left early, missed deadlines. Since then, he had been surviving on sporadic freelance work. But he still lived in that expensive apartment, frequented fancy restaurants, kept up appearances. That's when the pieces started to fit together. The constant requests for money. The urgency. The elaborate excuses about investments. He wasn't investing in anything. He was maintaining a lifestyle he couldn't afford. And I, as always, was the inexhaustible source of funds. I decided to go deeper. I hired a private investigator. I spent 1,000 reis I didn't have, but I needed to know the full truth. What he discovered in 2 weeks left me stunned. My son and daughter-in-law were neck-deep in debt. They owed money to banks, loan sharks, friends. The apartment was about to be repossessed for non-payment. The car I gave him was registered in his wife's name. The day after the party, she put it up for sale. I found the ad online. 550,000 reis. She was trying to profit from my gift. From my sacrifice. From my pain. I called the investigator and asked for more information. He brought me documents. Loan contracts with my son listed as the debtor. Some I recognized. They were loans he said were for investments. Others I had never seen. He had used my name as a reference without asking my permission. There was more. My daughter-in-law had a habit of spending fortunes on clothes, jewelry, and trips. All posted on social media, creating an illusion of wealth that didn't exist. She came from a wealthy family, but had been disinherited by her parents after the marriage. They didn't approve of my son. They thought he was a fortune hunter. The irony was bitter. I thought she was the problem. That she had driven my son away from me. But the truth was that they deserved each other. 2 parasites living off illusions and other people's money. And I was the biggest victim of that charade. 3 weeks after the party, my phone rang from an unknown number. I answered without thinking. It was my daughter-in-law. She had never called me before, except to invite me to the party. Her voice was sweet, almost syrupy. She said she was worried about me. That my son was remorseful but didn't know how to apologize. I stayed silent, letting her speak. She continued. She said they were going through financial difficulties. That the firm where my son worked was behind on salaries. A lie. He didn't even work there anymore. She said they needed help to pay some bills until things were resolved. I asked how much. 50,000 reis, she answered. Without hesitation. As if it were an insignificant amount. As if I had a money tree in the backyard. I explained that I didn't have it. That I had sold everything to buy the car. She was silent for a moment. Then she suggested that I could sell the workshop. Or take out a loan using the workshop as collateral. It was then that I realized something terrible. They knew exactly what they were doing at the party. The humiliation was not accidental. It was calculated. They wanted to break me emotionally so I would become desperate for their approval. So I would give even more money trying to win my son's love back. I hung up without answering. My head spun. 40 years of my life reduced to a manipulation strategy. My son was not only ungrateful. He was cruel. Deliberately cruel. And I had been blind all along. I returned to the workshop for the first time since the party. My employees greeted me with concern. I had disappeared without warning, leaving everything in the hands of my manager. They knew something was wrong, but they didn't ask. They just hugged me. I sat in my office and looked around. That place represented decades of hard work. Every machine had a story. Every scrap of fabric was a reminder of sleepless nights, bleeding fingers, aching backs. And I had been about to throw all of that away for a son who saw me only as a bank account. I called my lawyer. I asked him to prepare documents. I wanted to change my will. My son was listed as the sole heir to everything. The workshop, my savings, my retirement. Everything would go to him when I died. Not anymore. The lawyer tried to convince me to think it over. He said decisions made in emotion are rarely good decisions. I explained that this was not an emotional decision. It was the most rational decision I had ever made. He agreed and scheduled a meeting for the following week. That night, alone in the apartment, I opened a bottle of wine. I'm not a drinker, but I felt I needed it. I toyed with the glass as I thought about everything I had uncovered. My son saw me as an idiot. And maybe he was right. I had been an idiot. But not anymore. I thought about the party. The laughter. The looks of pity and mockery. I thought about how small, insignificant, ashamed I felt. I thought about how many times over the years I swallowed my pride, accepted crumbs of affection, settled for the minimum. I remembered the day he was born. How I held that tiny baby in my arms and promised I would give him everything. And I kept my promise. I literally gave everything. My youth, my health, my chances to restart my life. I gave every cent, every minute, every piece of myself. And in return, public humiliation, manipulation, lies, financial exploitation. A son who was ashamed of his own mother. Who hid from his rich friends that his mother was a simple seamstress. Who made up stories about how he had achieved everything on his own, as if I had never existed. The pain was there, deep and cutting. But along with it, something new grew. Anger. Not the explosive, irrational kind. It was a cold, calculated, determined anger. The anger of a woman who had finally woken up. Who finally saw the truth. Who finally decided to do something about it. I finished the glass of wine and made a list. Everything I had done for my son in the last 5 years. Every loan, every gift, every favor. Amounts, dates, circumstances. The list filled 3 whole pages. When I finished, the total was frightening. More than 500,000 reis. I put the list in the drawer. It would be useful soon. Because I had a plan beginning to form in my head. A plan that would return my dignity. That would show my son and his wife that underestimating a devoted mother was the biggest mistake they could make. I lay down that night unable to sleep. Not from sadness or anguish. But from anticipation. For the first time in 40 years, I was not thinking about how to help my son. I was thinking about how to get revenge on him. And that feeling, as wrong as it might seem, brought me a strange peace. Because finally, after decades of martyrdom, I was going to do something for myself. I was going to reclaim my life, my dignity, my worth. And my son, who had so enjoyed humiliating me publicly, was going to find out that messing with the wrong person has consequences. Consequences he would never forget. The next morning, I woke up with a mental clarity I hadn't felt in years. I made some coffee, sat at the table, and began to put my plan on paper. It wouldn't be an impulsive revenge. It would be meticulous, surgical, devastating. But before anything else, I needed to protect myself. The first thing I did was gather all the documents from the clothing shop. Contracts, bank statements, tax returns. I took everything to my lawyer's office. I explained that my son had access to information about my assets, and I needed to make sure he couldn't touch any of it. My lawyer was a serious man in his 50s. When I finished telling him everything I had discovered, he took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He said he had seen many cases of family financial abuse, but rarely something so systematic. He agreed to help me. We changed my will first. Instead of leaving everything to my son, I divided my inheritance. Half would go to a foundation supporting single mothers that I intended to create. The other half would be divided among my oldest employees, women who had worked with me for over a decade. Then, we created a trust fund with what remained of my savings. Approximately 80,000 reis. That money would be locked and could only be used for essential business expenses. I wouldn't even be able to withdraw it without approval from an independent administrator. That protected me from any pressure my son might try to exert. The lawyer suggested something else. He said I should formally document all unpaid loans, turn them into legal debts with interest. That meant that if my son ever tried to take legal action against me in the future, I would have concrete proof that he owed me money, not the other way around. We spent days preparing documents. Every loan was listed with its date, amount, and circumstances. I spoke to people who had witnessed some of those transactions. I gathered bank transfer receipts. When we finished, we had a 60-page dossier proving that my son owed me more than $500,000 reais. Meanwhile, I continued to monitor their situation. The investigator informed me that the car still hadn't been sold. Apparently, potential buyers backed out when they found out there were problems with the electrical system. The defect my son mentioned was real and was scaring people off. I also discovered something interesting. My daughter-in-law had a gambling debt. She frequented online casinos and had lost over 100,000 reais in the past 6 months. That explained part of their financial desperation. It wasn't just luxury spending. It was addiction. 2 weeks after our last conversation, my son showed up at the clothing shop. He hadn't called. He simply walked in as if nothing had happened. My employees grew tense. They knew something was wrong between us, even if they didn't know the details. He asked to talk in private. I took him to my office and closed the door. I didn't offer coffee. I didn't offer a seat. I just stood there with my arms crossed, waiting. He started with empty apologies. Said he was stressed at the party. That he drank too much. That it wasn't what he meant to say. But his eyes showed no real remorse. They showed calculation. He was testing the waters, seeing if I had softened. I let him talk. When he finished, I asked directly, "How much do you need this time?" He hesitated, then admitted it. 30,000 reais. Said it was to pay lawyers for a labor lawsuit. More lies. The investigator had already told me there was no such case. I replied that I had no money. That the business was going through difficulties. That selling my house and buying the car had left my finances tight. He looked visibly frustrated. He started arguing. Said I always found money for him before. That if I really loved him, I'd find a way. That was the first time I responded. I said that love can't be bought. And that he himself had made that clear at the party. He went pale. Tried to laugh it off, to make it seem like I was overreacting. But I didn't laugh. I just stared at him in silence until he looked away. He left the office slamming the door. I heard him complain loudly on his way out, saying something about how I was being dramatic. My employees looked at me with concern when I came out of the office. I reassured them. Told them everything was under control. But it wasn't. Not yet. Because refusing money was just the first step. I needed to do more. I needed to make sure they would never try to manipulate me again. And I had an idea how to do that. I started attending support groups for dysfunctional families. I met other mothers who had gone through similar situations. Ungrateful children, financial manipulation, emotional abuse. Listening to their stories made me stronger. I realized I wasn't alone. That my situation, as painful as it was, wasn't unique. One of those mothers gave me a valuable suggestion. She had written a public letter to her son, exposing everything he had done. Not to humiliate him, but to free herself. To put the truth into the world and take that weight off her chest. The letter went viral on social media and, according to her, it was the most liberating thing she had ever done. I considered the idea. Writing everything down. The party, the humiliation, the unpaid loans, the lies. But I wasn't sure I wanted to expose my life that way. I decided to keep that option as a last resort. Meanwhile, I focused on rebuilding my life. I started therapy. The therapist helped me understand the patterns I had followed for decades. How I confused love with sacrifice. How I allowed myself to be mistreated because I thought it was my duty as a mother to accept anything. She asked me a question that shook me. If your son treated anyone else the way he treats you, would you still respect him? The answer was obvious. No. I would be horrified. But somehow, when the victim was me, I justified it, rationalized it, forgave it. I began to set boundaries. I blocked my son on all social media, changed my phone number and only gave the new one to trusted people. I instructed my employees not to give out any information about me if he showed up again. At first, I felt guilty. That annoying voice in my head saying that mothers don't abandon their children. That I should try one more time. That maybe he'd change. But then I remembered the party. The laughter. The cruel words. And the guilt turned into determination. A month after the party, I received an email from my daughter-in-law. She had gotten my new address from some contact. The message was long and elaborate. She said they were desperate. That they were going to lose the apartment. That they had nowhere to go. That I was their only hope. The manipulation was obvious. But what caught my attention was a sentence at the end. Do you want your son to live on the streets? Do you want to be responsible for destroying his life? It was a blatant attempt at guilt-tripping me. To make it seem like I was the villain of the story. I replied. But not in the way she expected. I wrote that I wasn't responsible for their financial choices. That I had given more than any mother ever should. That they were adults capable of solving their own problems. And that I wouldn't respond to any further attempts at contact. I blocked her email too. I felt immediate relief. It was like letting go of a weight I had carried for years. Every time I set a boundary, said no, protected myself, I felt a little stronger. A little more myself. Then my friend, the one who had visited me after the party, made me an offer. She had a beach house that sat empty most of the year. She offered to let me stay there as long as I wanted. Said the sea air would be good for my soul. I accepted. I left the business in the hands of my trusted manager. She was competent and dedicated. I knew the business would be in good hands. I packed a small suitcase and went to the beach. The house was simple but cozy. It was in a small village, far from the city's hustle. I woke up the first day to the sound of the waves. I walked barefoot on the sand. Felt the sun on my face. For the first time in months, I smiled genuinely. I spent weeks there. No landline, no TV, just my new cell phone that almost no one had the number for. I read books I had always wanted to read but never had time for. Cooked elaborate meals just for myself. Watched the sunset every afternoon with a cup of tea. I met people from the village. An old lady who sold fish at the market told me about her life. 3 children, all living far away, but who called every week and visited whenever they could. She spoke about them with genuine pride. And they spoke about her the same way. I saw the difference. Healthy relationships between parents and children existed. They weren't perfect. But they were based on mutual respect, gratitude, true love. What I had with my son wasn't love. It was emotional dependency on my part and exploitation on his. One afternoon, while walking on the beach, I found a woman crying, sitting on the rocks. I approached her carefully and asked if she was okay. She looked at me with red eyes and began to talk. She was going through the same thing. An adult son who only appeared when he needed money. A cruel daughter-in-law who treated her like a servant. We sat together for hours. I shared my story. She shared hers. We cried together. And then we laughed together. We laughed at the absurdity of having raised people who despised us. We laughed at the ridiculousness of sacrificing so much for so little appreciation. She asked how I was dealing with it. I told her about the will, the documents, the boundaries. Her eyes lit up. She said she had never thought of doing something like that. That she always thought it was her duty to endure everything in silence. We talked until the sun went down. When we said goodbye, she hugged me tightly and said I had become an inspiration. That she was going to start valuing herself too. That encounter showed me something important. My story could help other people. My pain had purpose. I went back to the city after a month at the beach. I was renewed, stronger, more determined, and ready for the next phase of my plan. Because rebuilding my life was only part of the equation. The other part was making sure my son understood the consequences of his actions. I scheduled a meeting with my lawyer. Told him I was ready to finalize everything. The documents were signed. The will was registered. The debts were formalized. Everything I had built over 40 years was now protected. Protected from him. But there was one last thing I needed to do. Something that would give me definitive closure. Something that would show him I was no longer the woman he had humiliated at that party. I had changed. And he was about to find out just how much. 2 days after returning from the beach, I received a call from the investigator. My son and daughter-in-law were being evicted. The bank had finally executed the repossession of the apartment. They had a week to leave. The information should have brought me satisfaction. Some sense of justice being served. But all I felt was a strange emptiness. They tried to contact me through third parties. Mutual acquaintances, distant cousins, even the secretary at the atelier. All with the same message. They needed urgent help. They were desperate. I instructed each person to say that I was not interested in talking. On the morning of the 4th day, something unexpected happened. My son appeared at the door of my apartment. I don't know how he discovered my address. Probably bribing someone or investigating on his own. When I opened the door and saw him there, my first instinct was to slam it in his face. But something in the way he stood made me hesitate. He was not the arrogant man from the party. He had deep dark circles under his eyes, wrinkled clothes, unshaven. He looked like he had aged 10 years in 2 months. For the first time in a long while, I saw my real son. Not the mask he wore to impress others. He asked to come in. I refused. I said that anything he had to say could be said right there, in the hallway. He looked around, uncomfortable, aware that neighbors could hear. Fine. I was no longer ashamed. This was his era now. He started with apologies. Different from before. These seemed genuine. He said he was embarrassed. That he couldn't sleep thinking about the party. That he had been an idiot. But I had heard pretty apologies before. Words were easy. Real change was hard. I asked if he remembered what he said about me that night. He lowered his head. Whispered yes. I asked if he remembered the laughter. If he remembered how I felt. If at any point during those weeks he cared about what he had done to me. He remained silent. That silence told me everything. All this time, he had only cared about himself. His needs, his problems, his wounded pride. I only became relevant again when he needed something. Then he did what I expected. He asked for money. This time directly, without beating around the bush. He said he needed 50,000 reis. That they would live on the street without this help. That his wife was having anxiety attacks. That he saw no way out. I looked him in the eye and said no. Just like that. No. He was shocked. Tried to argue. Said I was his mother. That mothers don't abandon their children. That I had always helped him before. Why would it be different now? I replied that the difference was that now I had self-love. That I finally understood it was not my obligation to finance the life of an adult man who chose to publicly humiliate me. That his choices had consequences. And those consequences were no longer my problem. He turned red. For the first time, I saw genuine anger on his face. Not the fake anger he used to manipulate me. Real anger. He began to shout. Said I was selfish. That I had money saved and was refusing to help out of pure spite. That I was a terrible mother. I let him shout. When he finished panting, I calmly said he was right about one thing. I did have money saved. 80,000 reis. And every penny was protected in a fund he could never touch. Furthermore, he owed me over 500,000 reis in unpaid loans. If anyone owed anything here, it was him. I showed him a copy of the dossier my lawyer had prepared. 60 pages documenting every transaction, every loan, every broken promise. His eyes scanned the pages with growing horror. He didn't know I had kept everything. That I had concrete proof. I explained that these debts were now legal. With interest. And that if he tried any action against me, I would sue him for fraud and embezzlement. That I had witnesses, documents, everything needed to destroy any argument he could present. He went pale. Tried to say they were gifts, not loans. But I had messages from him promising repayment. Emails with investment plans that never materialized. I had everything. He was cornered and he knew it. That's when he changed tactics. The tears came. Not the manipulative ones I had seen before. They were tears of real despair. He fell to his knees in the hallway. Begged. Said he had nowhere to go. That he had made mistakes but didn't deserve to be on the street. That he would do anything. Part of me, that maternal part shaped by 40 years of conditioning, wanted to give in. Wanted to hug him, console him, fix everything as I always had. But a stronger part, the part that had grown during these weeks of pain and reflection, remained firm. I told him he had options. He could sell the car I gave him. Even with the defect, it would be worth at least 400,000 reis. Enough to pay debts and start over. He could look for a real job, not just occasional freelance work. He could admit the situation to his wife's family and ask for their help. Then he admitted something that surprised me. The car had already been sold. 3 weeks ago. For 350,000 reis. All the money was used to pay his wife's gambling debts. Not a cent of my sacrifice had been used for anything useful. It had gone straight to online casinos. I felt anger. Not for the first time, but this time it was different. It was cold, calculated anger. I asked why he thought I should help again when the previous gift had been wasted so irresponsibly. He had no answer. Then I did something I never imagined doing. I picked up my phone and called my daughter-in-law. She answered immediately, probably expecting news from her husband. I put her on speaker. Said we were here, he and I, having an important conversation. And that I wanted her to participate. I asked if she knew how much I had given my son over the years. She was silent. I insisted. She admitted she didn't know the exact amounts, but knew it was a lot. I asked if she knew that the car had been sold to pay her gambling debts. Silence again. Then I asked the most important question. I asked if she thought it was fair to publicly humiliate me and then expect me to continue being their source of income. If she thought I was so stupid as not to notice the manipulation. If she really believed that strategy would work. She hung up. Simply hung up in my face. My son was still on his knees, now crying silently. He said he didn't know she had gambling problems. He had only discovered when the car money disappeared. That she promised she would stop. I felt no pity. He was an adult. He chose to marry her. Chose to maintain an unsustainable lifestyle. Chose to use me as a personal bank. Chose to humiliate me. All his choices. All his consequences. Then I made my final offer. I said I would pay for 3 months' rent in a simple apartment. Not luxurious, just functional. It would give them time to reorganize, look for work, start over. But there were conditions. First, he had to sign a document acknowledging all debts. Second, he had to agree to repay, even if it took years. Third, both he and his wife had to start therapy immediately. Fourth, we would cut all contact for at least 6 months. He got up from the floor. Wiped his tears. Asked about the last point. I explained that we needed distance. That he needed to learn to live without using me as a financial crutch. That I needed to learn to exist without being defined by motherhood. That 6 months was nothing compared to a lifetime. He agreed. Did he have a choice? We signed the documents the next day, at my lawyer's office. He read every page carefully this time. Understood there was no escape. The debts were real, documented, legal. If he didn't comply, I could take legal action. I rented a small apartment in a modest neighborhood. Far enough that they wouldn't show up at my door. Paid 3 months in advance directly to the landlord. Gave them the address and the keys. And then I did something liberating. I deleted their number permanently. My lawyer acted as an intermediary. Any necessary communication would go through him. I would no longer have direct contact. For the first time in 40 years, my son did not have immediate access to me. Couldn't call me whenever he wanted. Couldn't show up asking for favors. He was free. And so was I. A few days later, I found a message at the lawyer's office. It was short. My son thanking me for the help and saying he was looking for a job. No elaborate apologies. No grand promises. Just a simple thank you. Maybe there was hope after all. Or maybe not. It was no longer my responsibility to find out. I returned to the beach house. This time I was not running away. I was choosing. Choosing peace over drama. Choosing myself over others' expectations. Choosing to live instead of merely survive. I sat on the veranda overlooking the sea. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and pink. I thought about everything that happened. The humiliation, the pain, the anger, the revenge, the partial forgiveness. It was not a traditional happy ending. But it was my story. And finally, after decades, I was in control of it. My phone rang. Unknown number. I thought about not answering. But something made me pick up. It was the woman I met at the beach, the one going through a similar situation. She called to thank me. Said that after our conversation, she found the courage to set boundaries with her son. We talked for hours. She told me how her life had changed. How she felt lighter, freer. How she was finally living for herself. She said I had been an inspiration. That my strength had motivated her to find hers. When I hung up, I realized something important. My pain had not been in vain. My story, as difficult as it was, had purpose. It could help other women trapped in similar situations. Could show that it's never too late to choose yourself. That night, I began writing. Not to publish, at least not yet. But to process. To understand. To turn all that pain into something useful. Words flowed. Hours passed. When I finished, I had 20 pages of memories, reflections, lessons learned. It was my story of liberation. Of a woman who spent 40 years living for someone else and finally decided to live for herself. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. Justice for me. Dignity for me. Self-love for me. And that justice, I realized, was the only one that truly mattered. 6 months had passed since that day in the hallway. 6 months without a single call, without a message, without any direct contact with my son. The silence that would have once frightened me was now comforting. I had learned to live without the constant anxiety of when the next request would come. I had learned to sleep without worrying about his problems. The beach house had become my permanent refuge. I bought it from my friend for a fair price. It wasn't large or luxurious, but it was mine. Every room decorated the way I had always wanted, not to impress anyone, just to make myself happy. I woke up to the sound of the waves and fell asleep to the smell of the sea air. The sewing business continued to run well under the supervision of my manager. I visited the city once a month for meetings and to handle important matters. But I delegated the daily operations. For the first time, the business didn't consume all my energy. I had time for myself. Time to discover who I was beyond being a mother and a businesswoman. I began giving volunteer sewing classes in the community. 3 times a week, girls from underprivileged families came to my home to learn the craft. Seeing their eyes light up when they finished their first piece was magical. I was passing on the skill that had saved my life. And unlike what I did with my son, I expected nothing in return. One of these girls was 15 and lived with her mother. Her mother worked 2 jobs to support 4 children. When I met her at a parent meeting, I saw my reflection from decades ago. The exhaustion in her eyes, the calloused hands, the silent determination. I spoke with her after the meeting. I offered her a job at the sewing business. Nothing that would interfere with her current jobs, just something extra on weekends. She cried with gratitude. She said no one had ever offered help without expecting something in return. I explained that I was just paying forward the luck I had when I started. Through these girls and their families, I found real purpose. Not the false purpose of living through someone else, but the genuine purpose of using my experience to ease the journey of those coming after me. It was rewarding in a way my son never could be. My lawyer updated me monthly about their situation. My son had found a job in a smaller office. The salary was modest compared to what he had before, but it was honest. He was gradually paying off his debts. 100 reais per month. It would take decades to pay everything off, but he was honoring the agreement. My daughter-in-law was attending therapy for her gambling addiction. According to the therapist my lawyer contacted, she was making good progress. She admitted the problem and was following treatment. She had found a job as a sales clerk in a clothing store. Nothing glamorous, but honest work. Part of me felt happy about this news. Not because I wanted to see them prosper to use me again, but because it meant my decision had been correct. They needed that shock. They needed to learn to live with their own resources. And they were learning, even if painfully. But I was not expecting reconciliation. I did not fantasize about emotional calls or apologies. That part of my life was over. Maybe in the future, when the wounds had completely healed, we could have some kind of relationship. But it would be different. Based on mutual respect, not obligation or guilt. I met new people in the village. I formed genuine friendships for the first time in years. Women my age with similar stories. Not necessarily with children, but with someone who had exploited them in some way. Husbands, brothers, fathers, all with their own scars. We created an informal support group. We met weekly at someone's house. We shared stories, laughter, tears. We celebrated small victories, like saying no for the first time or setting a boundary. These women understood my journey in a way no one else could. One of them encouraged me to publish my story. She said it could help thousands of women going through the same thing. I hesitated at first. Exposing my life like that was frightening. But then I remembered the woman I met crying on the beach. How my story had helped her. I created an anonymous blog. I published my story in chapters. I did not mention names or details that could identify anyone. Just the facts. Dedicated mother, ungrateful son, public humiliation, personal reconstruction. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of women commented. They shared their own stories. Some worse than mine, others similar. All with the same theme. Women who sacrificed everything for people who didn't value the sacrifice. And all seeking strength to change. I responded to every comment. Offered support, shared advice, validated feelings. The blog grew. Within 3 months, it had thousands of followers. Women from all over the country, some even from other countries, reading and relating to my journey. I received invitations to give talks. Initially, I declined. I didn't see myself as a speaker. But my support group encouraged me. They said I had something valuable to share. I accepted a small talk at a local library. 20 women attended. I spoke for an hour. No script, just from the heart. About sacrifice and boundaries. About self-love and toxic motherhood. About the difference between helping and enabling. When I finished, nearly everyone had tears in their eyes. Several hugged me afterward, thanking me for putting into words what they felt. It became a regular thing. Once a month, I gave a talk somewhere. Libraries, community centers, churches. I never charged. It wasn't about money. It was about raising awareness. About helping women realize they were not obliged to sacrifice themselves until they disappeared. The sewing business also shifted focus. I began hiring primarily single mothers and women in vulnerable situations. I offered fair wages, flexible hours, a supportive environment. I wanted to create the kind of opportunities one hadn't had when I started. The business prospered more than ever. I discovered that real purpose generates abundance. When I stopped using the business solely to finance my son and started using it to help other women, everything flourished. Orders increased, quality improved, the atmosphere became more positive. It was as if the universe rewarded my change in attitude. In the 7th month, my lawyer called with news. My son wanted to schedule a meeting. Not to ask for money, just to talk. He said he understood if I didn't want to, but he would like the chance to speak to me in person. I thought for days. Part of me wanted to refuse. I was fine, finally at peace. Why risk reopening old wounds? But another part, smaller but persistent, felt curious. 7 months was long enough for real change. Maybe it was worth listening. I agreed, but with conditions. The meeting would be at the lawyer's office. Last no longer than an hour. He could not ask for money or favors. It was just to talk. If he agreed, I would go. He agreed. The day of the meeting arrived. I drove to the city with a queasy stomach. It wasn't exactly fear. It was anxiety mixed with something close to cautious hope. I arrived 15 minutes early. He arrived exactly on time. When he entered the room, I barely recognized him. He was thinner with less hair, but there was something different in his eyes. The arrogance was gone. In its place was something close to humility. We greeted each other formally. He didn't try to hug me. He respected my space. He spoke first. He apologized. Not the shallow apologies from before. These were specific, detailed. He acknowledged every mistake. The humiliation at the party. The unpaid loans. The manipulation. The disrespect. He admitted he had been selfish, cruel, ungrateful. And he didn't expect forgiveness. He just wanted me to know that he understood now. He talked about the past months. How difficult it had been at first. How he and his wife almost separated. How therapy had helped them see toxic patterns. How working modest jobs made him appreciate everything I had done for him. How waking up without a financial safety net scared him into reality. I listened in silence. I didn't interrupt or comment. I just let him speak. When he finished, we sat in silence for a long moment. Then I spoke. I said I appreciated the apology. That it seemed genuine. But forgiveness takes time. I couldn't simply forget years of pain because of one conversation. He nodded. Said he understood. That he wasn't asking for immediate reconciliation. Just wanting to plant a seed. That if I allowed, he would like to slowly rebuild our relationship. Not as it was before, where he used me and I allowed it. But something new, healthier, based on mutual respect. I thought carefully before responding. I said I was open to the possibility, but there were conditions. He would continue paying the debts. He would continue therapy. And most importantly, he would need to prove through actions, not words, that the change was real. If he could do this for another 6 months, we could talk again. He agreed without hesitation. We said goodbye. This time, he asked permission for a hug. I allowed it. It was brief but sincere. When he left the room, I sat for a few minutes, processing. I didn't know if he had truly changed or if it was another well-crafted manipulation. Only time would tell. But one thing I knew for sure. The outcome didn't matter. I was okay. I had rebuilt my life. Found purpose. Created healthy boundaries. Even if he reverted to old habits, I would not return. The woman who allowed everything had died at that party. The woman who rose from the ashes was stronger, wiser, more complete. I returned to the beach that night. I sat on the balcony watching the sunset. I thought about everything that had happened in the past year. The humiliation that shattered my world. The anger that motivated me. The revenge that turned into justice. And finally, the peace I found, not because of him, but despite him. The lesson I learned was harsh but necessary. Maternal love does not mean infinite sacrifice. It means teaching responsibility, setting boundaries, allowing consequences. It means loving yourself enough not to lose yourself completely in another person, even if that person is your child. My story didn't end with magical reconciliation or instant forgiveness. It ended with me, alone but not lonely, on the balcony of my home, finally living for myself. And that, I realized, was the only ending that truly mattered. Not his approval or anyone else's, but my own inner peace. Today, I wake up every day grateful. Grateful for the pain that taught me to value myself. Grateful for the humiliation that showed me my worth. Grateful for the courage to start over at 65. And most importantly, grateful for having learned that it is never too late to choose yourself. If you have made it this far in the story, I hope it has touched your heart in some way. And if you are going through something similar, know that you are not alone. You have value. You deserve respect. And you have the right to live for yourself. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories.